Using a 19mm socket, let's go ahead and remove our lug nuts. If your vehicle is equipped with a hubcap like ours, go ahead and grab that hubcap or center cap, pop that off, grab the wheel, pull it off, and set it aside. Now we went ahead and we put our ignition key in the on position. That way there, we can go ahead and manually turn the wheel without it locking. I'm gonna go ahead and remove these bolts on the back side. This is 12mm. We're now going to go ahead and remove our brake caliper. Using your pry tool, go ahead and separate the caliper from the caliper bracket. You want to support that. You don't want to have tension on this flex line here. I'm going to go ahead and pop our brake pads off. Using a 17mm socket in your ratchet, I'm going to go ahead and loosen and remove the caliper bracket bolts. You remove your caliper bracket and set that aside. Now, if your brake rotor has these set screws here, there might be one down below as well. You want to go ahead and use a Phillips head screwdriver. Loosen this. If your vehicle does not have this, it is not critical to the operation of the vehicle. It's simply placed there to hold the rotor to the hub on assembly. Go ahead and remove that. Grab your rotor, put that aside. Use the punch to open up the little lock tabs right here, how it's dimpled in. Use a 32mm socket to remove the spindle or axle nut. Once you remove the spindle nut, you want to check and make sure that the spindle or axle is loose. You can push on it. Ours is nice and free. If yours is stuck, you want to go ahead and use a punch, put it in the middle of the spindle or axle right here, and you want to hit that so that it'll loosen that up. Using a 12mm socket, I'm going to go ahead and remove the bolt holding the flex line to the strut. I'm going to use a 10mm socket to remove the ABS line to the strut. I'm going to go ahead and use a 10mm socket right here to go ahead and remove this bolt holding the ABS sensor to the knuckle. I'm going to go ahead and grab our ABS sensor. I'm going to work that out, rocking it back and forth and gently pulling outward. Using a 19mm wrench and a 19mm socket, let's go ahead and remove the nut off of the strut bolt here. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and work these bolts out. Then what we're going to do is try and separate the knuckle from the strut. At the same time, we're going to try and work the CV axle out of the knuckle. I'm going to go ahead and use a pry bar. Go ahead and pull that knuckle off of the strut. At the same time, we're going to work the CV axle in. Once that's separated, you can go ahead and manipulate the knuckle out of the way while we pull the axle out. Now let's go ahead and pop the CV axle out of the transmission. Use a pry bar, and right where the CV axle goes into the transmission, I'm going to go ahead and pop this up, and then we're going to pry it out. We're going to pop that CV axle out like so. You want to have a catch can or some towels underneath in case some transmission fluid should leak out. You want to go ahead and have something to catch that. And grab the axle and pull that out. And we want to go ahead and remove the band clamp off of the CV axle boot. You can use a punch. You want to go right in here. Go ahead and we're going to take this right off. This is a non-reusable clamp. Let's go ahead and repeat for the inboard boot right here, inboard clamp. Now in doing this process, you want to make sure that this gear right here, this is your ABS tone ring, that this does not get damaged or marked up. So you don't want to do this and start hammering on concrete or pavement, because if you mess this tone ring up, it can interfere with your ABS and cause a light to come on the dash. Once we have the bands off, we now go ahead and separate the boot. And this is packed with grease. Now if your boot is torn, this grease might have already expelled out. So we're going to go ahead and cut this boot now to go ahead and remove it. Once we get this cut through, we'll go ahead and remove it. Now this particular CV axle end is held on by a snap ring further down the axle shaft. We're going to use a brass punch and we're going to hit around the perimeter here and try and work this down off of the shaft. So we're going to go ahead and start doing that. Best if you could put the shaft in a vise and then work this down. So now that we have the end off here, there is a clip right here. So what we're going to do is go ahead and clean this off and reboot it. Now let's go ahead and clean the end of the axle shaft here. Now if you're replacing the boot, chances are it's already been torn and you've already gotten dirt and debris and all kinds of stuff in here. So you want to go ahead and clean this here. Do an inspection of the splines, make sure everything looks good. You also want to go ahead and take this side here. You want to clean the inside of this. It's probably going to have dirt, debris, and maybe even some mud in there. So use your solvent. If you have a parts cleaner container, go ahead and dip this in there, clean it all out. Ours, we didn't actually have a torn boot, so it's actually still pretty clean. There's clean grease in here. We are going to wipe out some of this here, do a visual inspection, make sure everything looks good, and then we'll install our boot. At this point here, we can go ahead and take our new CV axle boot. Go ahead and slide that over the shaft end here. Now what we're going to do is take the grease packet, I'm going to cut off a corner on this here. And what we're going to do is you're going to use this grease packet. I'm going to put this all on the inside the bearing. And go ahead and pack this in. You're going to do this several times. You want to get as much of that grease inside those bearings as possible. You can go ahead, rotate the shaft, rotate the inside, get this packed in. And then go ahead and put some grease on the end of the splines right here. You can also put some grease inside the boot. Now what I want to do is take the CV axle end and line that up. Now we have to pop this CV axle end onto the spline shaft over that snap ring. So what we're going to do is use our rubber coated dead blow hammer and hit the end of the shaft and pop that on. We still have some splines showing inside, so we keep on tapping that on. And just keep doing this until the CV axle has bottomed out on the shaft. Now we're going to go ahead and install our band clamp on the axle itself. Now if you have the special tool to do this, you can go ahead and use these clamps. We're going to show you an alternate way to secure the boot. Once you have the band tight, I'm going to go ahead and tap over the end. And you can go ahead and tap over the ears. Bend over your tabs like so. And then you can use your cutter and cut off the excess tab here. Go ahead and cut off the excess. Now if you don't have the tool to do this, you can simply use a wire tie. We'll go to the inboard. Make sure that your boot is where it needs to be. Go ahead and snip off the excess. You can do this for the inside and the outside, or if you have the tool, you can use the two bands supplied with the on the outside and the inside. Now reaching into the transmission, there is a axle seal right here. I'm going to go ahead and wipe this down, do a visual inspection, see if there's any sort of tears or damage to it. If the axle seal is leaking, or even if it isn't, now's a prime time for you to go ahead and replace that. Ours looks to be pretty good, so we're just going to go ahead and install our axle. And take your CV axle, feed that down and in, get that lined up inside the seal. Should push that into the transmission. Now right in here we can see that the CV axle is not seated, so we want to go ahead and work that axle until that pops into the transmission nice and flush. So let's go ahead and do that. Now take your CV axle, we'll just bend that over, work that into the wheel hub. Work that knuckle up, and you can work that CV axle through the hub. Once you see the axle start to come through, we can now work the knuckle into the strut and get this reattached. Now we're going to use our dead blow hammer to try and work the knuckle in, hit the control arm up, just so we can get our bolt started. And it might take some persuasion and movement by hands as well. Once we have this one lined up, we can now go ahead and line up the lower bolt, and we'll put both of those in. Get that bottom bolt lined up. Go ahead and get our nuts installed. Thread those on as far as you can. Then we'll go ahead and snug those down. Just go ahead and snug these down. Go ahead and install our axle nut. Let's go ahead and snug that down. Go ahead and torque these down to 80 foot-pounds. Install our ABS wire bracket. Put this little tab in the hole there. Go ahead and get the bolt started. Once we get that started, we're going to go ahead and install our ABS sensor right here. Line this up inside. Go ahead and work the sensor into position. Then go ahead and get the bolt started. Snug these down. We're going to go ahead and install a couple lug nuts here. I'm going to go ahead and use a pry bar on the lug nuts, and we're going to go ahead and torque down the axle nut to 134 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and remove our lug nuts. Set those aside. Now what we're going to do is dimple the spindle nut into the CV axle here. I'm going to go ahead and line up our brake rotor and slide that into place. I'm going to go ahead and line up our brake caliper bracket. And we're going to get our bolts started. Let's go ahead and snug those down. Let's go ahead and install our outboard brake pad. And we'll repeat for the inside. We'll install our inboard brake pad with the squeak tab at the bottom. We're going to grab our brake caliper. Bring our hose up and over. Just get our bolts installed. Once we snug those down by hand, we'll snug those down with our ratchet. Now as we're trying to tighten this here, our slider is rotating, so we're just going to grab that. Let's install our brake flex line bolt. Snug down this bolt. Once it's snug, just give it a little extra more. There you go. Let's torque down our caliper bracket bolts to 79 foot-pounds. Torque down our caliper bolts to 25 foot-pounds. If you have your brake rotor screw, you can go ahead and install that. If you don't, that's totally fine. And just snug that down. Go ahead and install the wheel. Now, if your vehicle is equipped with the hubcap that locks on with the lug nuts, you want to go ahead and locate the notch in the hubcap for your valve stem. Line that up. And we'll get those lug nuts started. I'm going to go ahead and snug down the lug nuts. Let's go ahead and torque our wheel down to 80 foot-pounds.